So we're going to go ahead and turn to Joshua chapter 5 today, and we are in the process of them actually coming to the point of Jericho. They're right there. They're within visible distance. They were even on the other side of the river. Last week we saw that they completed the crossing of the Jordan River, and God has them in a season of preparation now for the next step, the next stage. And often in life, if we backtrack just a little bit, they were at the Jordan River, and at flood stage at max, the Jordan River could be 2 miles across. But typically in the dry season, the rest of the year, it's just a little creek that you can wade across without any problem. Now, we don't know how much rain and how much water they had during that season particularly, but apparently it was enough to be an impressive amount because God had parted the Jordan River, as he did for the Red Sea and the Israelites initially, and that actually we'll see here in the first couple of verses is going to shock and inspire dread into the pagan people that are around Israel at that time. But oftentimes when God has us finish a difficult time and get through a challenge, is it all just smooth sailing from there and no more challenges? Any of you? Sometimes, right? Occasionally. But most of the time, you get through one. Eric says not at all. No. Most of the time you get through one challenge, and then you're like, okay, great, this is going to be wonderful. And then you look up and like, oh, those are the walls of Jericho. Okay, God. I know you got this, but man, couldn't I just get this nice, easy stretch? And that's not how life is. That's not how God has designed it. And we're going to see that challenge that they've passed, they're getting prepared for another challenge that's happening. And we'll look into that just a little bit today. But let's look ahead at verses 1 through 8 in Joshua chapter 5. And some of this preparation that they do is going to be right away, and it's going to impact them right away as well. So actually, would someone just read verse 1 for us? We'll just start out small.
When all the Amorite kings across the Jordan to the west, and all the Canaanite kings near the sea, heard how the Lord had dried up the water of the Jordan before the Israelites until they had crossed over, they lost heart, and their courage failed because of the Israelites.
And this is something that even before this time, when the spies visited Rahab in Jericho in chapter 2, she said something very similarly because of what happened with the parting of the Red Sea. So that was still in the minds of many of these people. They heard stories of that. They heard about this vast number of people that were across on the other side of the Jordan. And but this was something that, maybe they thought, oh, it's just stories, and these people will never come to the promised land. All of a sudden, this river parts. The Israelites cross over, and this news of this spreads not just around Jericho, but throughout all of the Levant area. And so they were in dread and in fear. Now, if you were leading the Israelites, militarily speaking, and you were knowing that you would need to go into battle, would you be like, they're afraid right now, let's go ahead and back off and wait for them to get time to collect themselves? Or would you just go for them right then? Go for them, right? Yeah. And that's exactly not what God told him to do. So would somebody read verses 2 through 7?
At the same time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites again." So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the Israelites at Gilbad Rolah. This is why he did so. All those who came out of Egypt, all the men of military age, died in the wilderness on the way after leaving Egypt. All the people that came out had been circumcised. But all the people born in the wilderness during the journey from Egypt had not. The Israelites had moved about in the wilderness 40 years until all the men who were of military age when they left Egypt had died, since they had not obeyed the Lord. For the Lord had sworn to them that they would not see the land he had solemnly promised their ancestors to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So he raised up their sons in their place, and these were the ones Joshua circumcised. They were still uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised on the way.
So what's interesting about this is the timing. So before, when they were crossing the Jordan River, they had defeated the couple of kingdoms that were over there. They had them subjected for a number of years. They were living in that land, and God was providing the manna. Everything was great. And you would think that would be the time, as far as tactics, to be like, let's go ahead and get this circumcision done. It's important because it's a sign of the covenant. It's a sign of that we belong to God. And that way there's time to rest up and heal up. but instead they crossed the Jordan River. And let me get my map real quick. So Gilgal, the city, is right here, but Camp Gilgal, which they were at, basically the tips of my two fingers are how close it was. It's within a couple of miles. It's very, very close. And you would think under the foot of the enemy's wall, so to speak, with all of these other pagan kingdoms around, would not be the best time to be at your most vulnerable. Now, you might remember there's a story in Genesis that kind of relates to this. Does anyone remember, or can think of that story? Eric?
The Dinah.
Yeah, Dinah. And what happens there?
It's not good after 3 days
Yes.
for the Shechemite people.
Yeah, they'd raped one of Jacob's daughters, and as a result, they tried to work out a covenant agreement where they'd say, hey, you're going to be a part of us. Part of that is circumcision. All the males agreed, and Jacob's sons didn't. They were still not happy with that, and so they took that opportunity to slaughter their enemies. So they couldn't fight back. And
Well,
so
Levi and Simeon, only 2 of them. The other guys are like,
that's fair. Yes, thank you. Only 2. Now, if at this point that they were very vulnerable, they were right across the river, that these enemy kingdoms said, you know what? Before these guys have time to get organized, now is the time to attack. God would have had to intervene. The Israelites would not have been able to defend themselves. And so it's interesting that God took them to a point of vulnerability. But what did He do to protect the Israelites that we'd read?
Parting the Jordan River.
Part of the Jordan River, and then what happened as a result for the way that people thought of the Israelites? Oh yeah, put the fear and dread of God and also of the Israelites in these other nations, and so they were not ready to attack. That God did that deliberately and intentionally. The Israelites might not have put 2 and 2 together, but that's the reason why God did that, just to show that His protection and His provision was there. And so they went ahead and completed circumcision. Now, would someone read verse 9 for us?
Then the Lord said to Joshua, This I have rolled away the reproach. This day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. Therefore the name of the place is called Gilgal to this day.
And Gilgal again means wheel, so it can mean rolling or rolled away. It's a play on a name. But the reproach that he's talking about, well, part of it is that when they were in Egypt, initially, when Moses came, very few of them, including Moses' own son, until he came back to Egypt, were not circumcised as that sign of the covenant. That's something that God gave Abraham long ago. They just hadn't been obedient in that. And of course, they had done that, but while they were in the desert, they were not keeping up with that sign of the covenant. And so that could be part of it. There was not enough differentiation between the Israelites and the Egyptians. But more than that, there was, through some verses in Deuteronomy and through Exodus, some mockery that was going on towards God and directed towards Israel as well. So I'm going to read to you Exodus 32:12, just to give an example of this. This is Exodus 32:12, in case you wanted to look it up as well. You don't have to. But there's quite a few verses in Deuteronomy that indicate this as well. And so they're in the desert here, and there we go. Moses is saying, in verse 11, Moses implored the Lord and his God and said, O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt? This is in response to the golden calf. That God has said, I'm just going to start over with you, Moses. I'm going to destroy the Israelites. Moses intercedes. And then he says in verse 12, why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent did he bring them out, to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? So time and time again in Deuteronomy as well, Moses repeats something very similar where the surrounding nations and also the Egyptians he seems to be alluding to this idea that these Egyptians are, at first in fear and dread of the Israelites because of all the plagues and all that God has done in rescuing the Israelites. Their army is destroyed. Their land is just in chaos. And after 40 years go by, that doesn't seem to be the case. And even maybe after a few months, they kind of get used to that and they think, these supposed great and mighty people with this great God are obviously unable to bring them in the promised land because when they initially go in a foray onto that, they've been disobedient. God actually defeats them and has them wander in the desert for 40 years. And so all these people basically are considering Israel and their God as inept. And so this is a reproach to God. And so God has rolled away the reproach from Israel. So before, when they were repulsed, it was their disobedience, and now they're being fully obedient to God. That reproach has been taken away by God. So he says, today I've rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. And so would someone read verse? So that's first preparation, is they've done the sign of circumcision. They've acknowledged that they are part of the covenant people. They're continuing to affirm that and trusting God even to the point where it's like, this is not a convenient place or time, but we're going to listen to you, God. So they're being obedient, unlike their forefathers. Now, the second part of preparation is in verses 10 through 12. Would someone please read those verses?
Now the,
Go ahead.
now the children of Israel camped at Gilgal and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at twilight on the plains of Jericho. And they ate of the produce of the land on the day after Passover, unleavened bread and parched grain on the very same day. Then the manna ceased on the day after they had eaten the produce of the land, and the children of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate the food of the land of Canaan that year.
All right, and so somebody remind us what Passover was for. What did it celebrate or mark? What was Passover about?
It was about
The death angel.
the death angel passing over them in Egypt.
Right. Yeah, back in Egypt, 40 years, basically to the day, actually exactly to the day. That's what they were celebrating, is that time when the angel of destruction came and killed every firstborn, except for
Those who mark the doorpost, the blood of the Lamb.
exactly. Yeah, they took hyssop, they dipped it in the blood of the lamb, put it in the lentils. Lentils?
Lentil.
Yeah, it sounds weird because I eat lentils, and I don't think that they ate those. Those are different kind of lentils. But they put the blood on the lentils. This is not a recipe. Don't follow it. And the angel of destruction passed over, and that's why it was called Passover. And so it remarks that time when God did free them from Israel. It was that last ultimate plague that just ultimately broke Egypt to the point where the Egyptians were bribing the Israelites to leave their land. They were giving them goods and gold and clothes and all sorts of things. So God He instructed them to celebrate this from that very first moment all the way up until the present day. Now, there are times when they enter the land, actually many times, where they do not celebrate the Passover faithfully, but they start off well. These are a faithful people. And so what was the purpose? So one other thing it mentions here actually that stopped. What stopped here in these verses?
Manna.
The manna. Okay, and manna, it describes it as like coriander. I don't think it tastes like coriander because that would not make very good bread. But just a small little grain that would appear there in the day, and they'd pick it early in the day, and it would not appear when? On the Sabbath, yeah. And so what was some of the purposes of manna initially?
Keep them alive.
Yes. Yeah, they were in a desert, right?
Yeah.
So not a lot of growing of crops. They had some animals and certain things, but yeah, primarily what they had was that manna, and they would have died apart from it. What else was the reason for the manna?
Give us this day our daily bread. Right, it was to show the dependence they had on God.
Yes, yeah. Not only just to keep them alive, but help them understand that it was God who ultimately kept them alive and provided for them. And then there was one other important piece with the manna.
Well, I thought I don't know if this is what you're looking for, but it did not last, so it kept them dependent on God for a recurring dependence on Him, because it would mold and wither and not be good to eat after one day. So they had to go out and gather. In other words, they had to make an effort, and then God returned their effort in kind.
Right, yeah, they would gather what they needed for the day. If they had too much, they could give it away. But if they tried to keep it, it's just nasty and wormy.
Yeah.
Except,
On Friday.
yeah, on Friday, the day before the Sabbath. And what would happen on Sabbath day with the manna? Be good. And if you didn't gather it double on Friday, like God said,
You still have them.
well, if somebody shared with you, yeah. But if you didn't go out and gather before a double portion for 2 days, you'd go out looking for it on the Sabbath, and you're going to fast that day.
Yeah.
Maybe you learn your lesson pretty quick.
If you live.
Yeah, exactly, yes. Dave.
This goes back to the Passover, excuse me for changing tracks here. Are there any Jews, like the Orthodox, still practice putting the blood on the doorpost today? Or is it just kind of gone with the times.
I think it's just a
I
meal.
think it's just the Orthodox, but I don't know. Does anyone know the answer to that? If that's still celebrated, the putting the blood on the door. Yeah, we don't.
I thought it was just the meal.
What?
I thought it was just the meal itself that they
Yeah.
did.
Yeah.
I didn't-
Because that was a one time. I don't know that they even celebrated that because I don't. I'd have to reread the Exodus, the instructions for
Oh,
future
just a
Passovers.
one-time thing?
Yeah.
I believe it was just the
Because
angel of
it's
destruction
the
then.
Feast of Unleavened Bread, not the Feast of Blood on the Lintel.
Yeah. And the leaven was that sign of sin, Charlotte.
The Chinese have an interesting custom. On Chinese New Year, they put red banners beside and over the door.
Hmm.
And some of the missionaries think that this is back to their origin, because there are other things that came from that time too.
Yeah, there's some interesting things with the Chinese. If you ever have a chance to talk to Charlotte, but really that look like that they have some Judeo-Christian roots, which is astonishing for where they're at with some of their early language and some of their early religion. You would not think that looking on the surface, but it's worth looking into if you have an interest.
If you see any of the movies, now that, of course, it's movies, but many times the Jewish people, they pat the doorpost or something like that. They did it in Ben-Hur, they did it in Fiddler on the Roof. I don't know if that was just a tradition that they inserted into the movie, or that the reason for my question is that still going on somewhere remotely today?
I have not heard of it. I do not know. That's Herman.
Do you have any thoughts on verse 11 where it said, then they went out and ate the fruit of the land? Where in the world did they go? Here, millions of people coming across, there's not gonna be farmers markets there. Do you have any thoughts on where they got their food from?
It was McDonald's. Our pastor is right. The Diet Coke is phenomenal there. So they got good no. So this was in the month of Nisan, and so it's early in the year. It's traditionally when a lot of new things were harvested, and so they do winter planting, and they'd be reaping all of these things. And that's why we'll look at the archaeology next week, but that's why Jericho and the archaeology from the time that their grain coffers and their grain bins and basins are burned, but also very, very full. And it's unusual. You normally don't find a city that is destroyed by siege warfare that had walls that has that combination. Like it's like, oh yeah, burned but empty, or full but somebody capitulated and let them in. You don't find both, because it's what happens in here is true. So the Israelites are there in the land. All this stuff is being harvested, and as they send, I'm sure, scouting parties of different people out. There's all these fields and all these animals and all these things, because you can only hold so much in a city. It's a lot, but there is going to be a problem, which we'll look at in just a second. Well, I can talk about it now. The people of Jericho, they have just all the food they can eat. They can probably hold out a year, maybe 2 years, depending on how they ration things. Versus the Israelites, the manna has stopped. So before Joshua might have in his mind, you know what? We can surround these people in the walls and just kind of starve them out, because, man, God is just providing that manna every single day, except on the Sabbath. Get double for that. And these people don't have that. So eventually they're going to run out of food, and we're not, and we're going to win. It's going to be easy. And then God stops the manna. And so, yes, you have this initial stuff that they can make really tasty food. Because, I mean, if you've been eating the same thing for 40 years and you get something different, I'm like, oh, man, that's some good stuff. So they've been enjoying that, but that is going to eventually run out, and it's going to be difficult and dangerous for them if at some point they have to surround the city and it lasts months and months, and they have to send people out to go guard the fields and work the fields and just kind of divide up. It's not going to be a good situation, so it's going to be very dangerous. Yeah, that I forgot did I answer your question, Herman? I kind of chased a rabbit.
It was asking where the food, it said they ate the produce of the land.
Oh, yeah.
Where did it come from?
Yeah, it's from Jericho and the surrounding areas as well. That there was
It's the promised land, so I would think there would be a lot for them.
land flowing with milk and honey.
Would
And
it also be reasonable to assume that if they were in dread of this approaching people, a lot of the people would have fled and left the crops in the field that they could have
yeah, Jericho,
harvested?
archaeologically speaking, it looks like it was 1,000 to 2,000 people at this time normally, which you think, oh, that's a tiny city. I mean, it had pretty good walls and everything, but the thing is, the city would have been swollen with refugees from the countryside, and they would have brought their food and their animals and just bursting at the seams. And so they had plenty of food, but a lot of people as well, but they left behind homes and fields, and they can only take so much with them. And so the Israelites were able to take that, and God had referenced and promised that in Moses' day that they would eat from the vines and the vineyards that they had not planted. They would sleep in homes that they had not built. And so God was fulfilling that as well. Eric?
You know, another place where Israel got tested in their faith and pride is, can you imagine the first person that went out to collect the manna that morning and went, whoa, what's up? Because that would have been a really, I'm sure there wasn't an announcement, hey, everybody, tomorrow morning, no manna. But somebody went out to collect it, and can you just see them looking at each other going, do you notice anything different today?
Yeah.
And then having to go, oh, well, we got this.
Yeah, and in addition to that, I mean, somebody had to figure out it was food, right?
Well, God told them, but somebody had to take the first
Somebody
bite.
had to take the first bite and say, oh, this is good for food.
Yep.
You know?
Yeah.
Because if it's just like seed, I mean, you don't know, is it a group of bugs or what is it? I mean,
They
it's
may
just
not
on
have
the
been
ground.
foraging.
I mean,
And they didn't know about nutrition then, but we'd be asking, is it nutritionally complete, or do we need to have some supplement?
Low carb diet.
Is it
Yeah.
organic?
Is it keto? Probably not.
Once you get it,
Eric, what you were talking about was the food stamps stop.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the purpose of the manna was,
Not getting food.
of course, survival. It was to remind them that God ultimately is the one that's providing, and also to set that pattern for the week. That through 40 years of living it and practicing it, you'd be like, okay, the Sabbath is for rest, because literally manna does not come on that day. You need to collect double in preparation for that, and then you rest on the Sabbath. And so that would be a pattern that would be very easy to follow after 40 years, because that's all you knew. And it's one of those things where if you grow up with it, it's easy to just accept that as normal, including the manna, that they probably, those that were young when that first started, and then they were all of a sudden, like 43, 44, when they were entering the land, and it stopped. That to them was weird, that the manna stopped, not the fact that the manna was coming. It's so like, I grew up in Alaska, like many of you know, and a lot of people ask me about the winters and the light, and it gets very dark and it's very cold, and we get a lot of wind, and they say, oh, it must be so hard with all that light in the summer, all the darkness at night. And it's like, well, honestly, if you're born into it like I was, you don't know any different. It's just normal. If I moved up there now, that would be really hard. But these people got to put a pattern in their life of, hey, you need me for survival. I truly do miraculously provide, and I've given you a bit unusual instructions in that for whatever reason, because God designed it, if you take more manna than you need, it's going to rot, except for one day of the week, every single time faithfully. And that one day you're not going to have manna, you're going to rest. And so they would learn day after day after day for the 40 years, okay, we need to listen to God's instruction, which is key, because Joshua is going to be put in a weird situation here. And so I need somebody to read verses 13 through 15, please.
And it came to pass, when Joshua was by Jericho, that he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, are you for us or for our adversaries? So he said, no, but as commander of the army of the Lord I have now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped, and said to him, what does my Lord say to his servant? Then the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, take your sandal off your foot, for the place where you stand is holy. And Joshua did so.
All right, so before we look at who this is, whose side is this commander of the army of the Lord on?
God's.
No.
Yeah, not Joshua's, right? And not Jericho's.
God's.
He's on God's. So Joshua might have in his mind prior to this, these are the Lord's people. These are the covenant people. And I am their commander. I'm their leader. So I'm the commander of the armies of the Lord. He's not. So let's look at who this is. So this isn't just an ordinary man, and there's a few indications we have of that. Now, first in in verse 13, the idea that Joshua stumbles on him in his eyes and he sees this human-looking figure standing before him with a drawn sword. If it's an angel, by the way, the only two places that, other than this, that an angel has a drawn sword out, that's Balaam on his donkey, and his donkey swerves and keeps him from being killed because the angel will destroy him. And during the great famine, or great plague rather, that David is at the threshing floor where the temple is ultimately built, and he prays and God intercedes. Well, God stops the angel of destruction there that has a sword drawn. So even if it's just an ordinary man, which I do not believe, a drawn sword does not bode well for friendly relations. But he asks, he says, okay, whose side are you on? Now, as soon as he hears a response, he says, no, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come. And so what is Joshua's immediate response?
One of the other things on the angel, it seems like every other time people see angels, they drop to the ground in fear and trembling.
Yeah.
Here Joshua walks up to him.
Yeah. Joshua walks up to him, and while he does drop, his response is worship or reverence. It is not dropping, trembling in fear, begging for your life. It's interesting when it's an angel, a normal angel, most of the time the first word that they have to say is, do not be afraid. The reason why is angels are not human. We have this idea sometimes through media or shows or pictures that angels are nice looking white women that just have a nice radiant face and smile and wings and a halo and a white robe and all that. Angels are normally depicted as male, and when I understand that there's some symbolism there, but when they're depicted, such as in Ezekiel, they do not sound human at all. And there's a reason why, I will say, a visible reason why people respond the way they do to the angels appearing with that fear, is because they are not human, and they're also mightier than us. Now we'll talk more about who this is. It says specifically this is an angel of the Lord, or this is the angel of the Lord, rather. But first in verse 14, it says that Joshua's response was that Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped. Now, some of you may have a different translation there. Before we get to Eric, does anyone have a different word there for worship?
Reverence.
Reverence, yes, reverence, right. And so the idea is this is more than another translation, I believe, has homage, that you're just paying your respects. This is not what the Israelites would do. This is not how they treat those people, such as Joshua and Moses, that are being honored. So Joshua understands that there's somebody more. Eric first, and then Dave.
Yeah, and all of the other instances that I'm aware of in Scripture with an angel and a human falling down to worship, the angel always looks at him and says, yo, get up.
Yep.
I'm not to be worshipped.
Let's look at those, actually. So need somebody to look at Revelation 19:10. So Revelation 19:10, who wants to get that one? All right, Robert will get that. And Revelation 22:8-9.
And Daniel too, right?
Yeah, we'll just look at two. All right, thanks, Steve. And Dave, I've not forgotten your hand was raised, so hold on to your question for just a second. All right, do you have the Revelation 19?
Yes.
All right.
Then I fell down at his feet to worship him, but he said, no, don't worship me. I am a servant of God, just like you and your brothers and sisters who testify about their faith in Jesus. Worship only God. For the essence of prophecy is to give a clear witness for Jesus.
Yep. And then Steve?
Revelation 22:8-9. I, John, am the one who heard and saw these things. And when I heard and seen them, I fell down to worship at the feet of the angel who had been showing them to me. But he said to me, don't do that. I'm a fellow servant with you and your fellow prophets, and with all who keep the words of this scroll. Worship God.
And the only times when it seems like an offering is actually given or worship is given and it's accepted is when it's specifically the angel of the Lord. And that's somebody that's probably different than a normal angel. We'll talk more about that in a second. But Dave, do you have a...
Maybe I didn't hear or understand it, but there was also an angel at the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve were kicked out, playing the sword.
Right. Yeah, that's a cherubim, or no, seraphim? Cherubim. It was a cherubim.
Yeah.
Yeah, cherubim a guardian type angel, not in the sense that the secular culture thinks, but to guard the Adam and Eve from going back in the garden and also from eating that tree of life fruit. And of course, the seraphim, that's another word for angel, that means burning one. These are scary, powerful, amazing beings. But this is, I believe, something more than an angel as well, because first clue is they accept worship. Another example of where an angel of the Lord, specifically the angel of the Lord, accepts worship is Judges 13. You can look at it later, but it's Manoah, so it's Samson's mom and dad, and they give an offering and it's accepted. But they are worshiping very much, and it's not an angel. There's not a rebuke like there is in Daniel and also in Revelation. Second clue is the identity of this person. So what do they call themselves again? What's their title? Yeah, commander of the army of the Lord. Now the Lord, there's a lot of names of God, but one of them is, I don't really like to use a divine name, but Yahweh Sabaoth, which is the Lord of hosts, or literally Lord of armies. And he refers to himself quite constantly as the Lord of hosts or the Lord of armies throughout the Old Testament. And so God does indeed have a host, and it's not just Israel. So would somebody read, well, I can actually read this. It's a little bit longer. Revelation 19, 11 through 16. Again, looking at Revelation, but there's some other indications of this as well. We're going to look and see who leads these armies. Revelation 19, 11 through 16. And by the way, as we're looking at this, if you come to a different conclusion than I do of like who the identity of this person is, there's many great expositors that have. And so this is one of those areas where we have liberty to disagree, and that's fine. We can discuss, we can debate. We don't need to divide over things like this. So if you're like, I have a different perspective, or I think these verses indicate such and such, that is completely fine. It's not one of those things that's significant for, like, we can't worship together if we don't believe that, or you're lost because you don't believe that this person's the same person as I do. None of that. So Revelation 19:11 says, this is John again, then I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes are like a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems, and he has a name written that no one knows but himself. He is clothed in a robe dipped in blood, and the name by which he is called is the Word of God. And the armies of heaven, arrayed in fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword, which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of fury of the wrath of God Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So, what is the identity of this person here?
Jesus.
Yeah, and this one we do need to agree on because it's very obvious. King of Kings, Lord of Lords, the Word of God, yeah. And he's clearly leading the armies of God there. And so I would submit, and I believe that the commander of the army of the Lord, or the armies of God, the Lord of hosts, is Jesus Christ himself, that he is the one that's leading that. And I believe that this is a pre-incarnate appearance. Because God is capable of doing that. He did that with Abraham as well, right before he would destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. He appeared and had that discussion with Abraham. And of course, Abraham ultimately recognized that it was the Lord. Now, we have two indications here. So after Joshua worships, and then he says, what does my Lord say to his servants? What's the first command that this commander of the armies of the Lord tells him?
Remove your sandals because you're standing on holy ground.
Take off your sandals. Good thing it's not shoes, otherwise you have to unlace them. But yeah, take off your sandals because you're standing on holy ground. Where else do we see that in Scripture? Yep, Moses in the burning bush. And it's interesting there, the wording of that. So let me read that real quick. We're skipping around a bit, I realize, but it's Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Just to take us back a little bit, Exodus 3, 1 through 6 says, Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness. It came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord, yeah, it doesn't say the Lord, it says the angel of the Lord, appeared to him in a flame of fire in the midst of the bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight. The bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he had turned to see, God called him out of the bush Moses, Moses, he said, here I am. And then he said, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place you are standing is holy ground. And it says there, again in verse 4, when the Lord, and that's, if your translation is like mine, it's all caps, that's the divine name of God. That is God. So angel of the Lord seems to be equated with the Lord, with God here. And this, is not just an ordinary being, because an ordinary man or even an angel would not allow them to be worshipped, probably wouldn't be called the commander of the army of the host of the Lord, and would not command a similar command to what happened with Moses as far as them taking their feet, or taking the sandals from their feet because the ground is holy, because angels are not the source of holiness. Eric?
Any thoughts on why they took their shoes off?
Boy, I've studied that in the past, and I'm not sure. I can't quite remember I'll phone a friend. So if any of you have an idea.
Reverence, showing reverence.
For sure is. I don't know the reason for the shoes specifically. There was something, but
I would think that it was an item created by man, and by taking them off, you have man created by God on the earth created by God. And there's nothing created by man in between those two items.
could be. Yeah, and it may be something just as simple as, when you go over to somebody's house and they have nice carpet, you take your shoes off in respect. A little bit more to that, but just out of respect and reverence. It's been a while since I've looked at that, and it's not coming to my mind. So, but something for you guys to look at this week for homework if you'd like. One other indication that this is something more than just an ordinary man. We're just going to read this portion. We're not going to study it. We're going to save it for next week. But in verses 1 through 7 in chapter 6, it says, Jericho was shut inside and outside because of the people of Israel. None went out and none came in. And the Lord said to Joshua. Now, in your translation, does it have Lord in all caps, all cap letters?
Yeah.
If it doesn't, it's still fine. It's a good translation. But some translations use that as a tool, that if your translation differentiates, when it's all caps, it's the divine name. It's a tetragrammaton. It's Yahweh. Different pronunciations of that. But this is the divine name saying that. So this is God himself speaking to Joshua. And he says, see, I have given Jericho in your hand. And the idea is not that this commander is there and says, hey, take off your sandals because you're on holy ground and I'm out of here. God's going to talk to you now. No, this is the Lord talking to Joshua. This is why he accepted worship. This is why the ground is holy. This is why Joshua listens, because this is the Lord. This is, I believe, Jesus Christ in pre-incarnate form. It's called a theophany, if you want to look into that. But he gives them some weird instructions, and God enjoys doing this, not because God likes to make people do the hard things and go the hard route, but because ultimately he wants the glory. And he does that for Israel's good and also for those that are in the nation. But these instructions are very, very much like the strange instructions that was given for them crossing the Jordan River. And he does that, if you look at the book of Judges, the way he delivers through those judges, he picks people that are, except for Samson, not fit to lead and not fit to judge and not fit to rescue Israel at all. We might look at that maybe as the next book possibly. Samson's the one exception, and he was maybe the worst judge. So go figure. But he gives them some very strange instructions. So Joshua might have in his mind, we'll surround the city and we'll maybe try to go up to the wall and climb over it, because they don't have siege equipment. They don't have knowledge of doing this. And instead, God already has a battle plan. And so he says, see, I have given Jericho into your hand, with its king and mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all the men of war going around the city once. Thus shall you do for 6 days. 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, you will hear the sound of the trumpet. Then all the people will shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up, everyone straight before him. Now we're going to look more at that next week. But is this, if you're military, if you're in the army, and Eric, anyone else in the army or military? Okay, 3 of you. All right. So if you're in a battle, you're preparing for a battle, even let's just say it's a mock battle, and your commander tells you to do something like, hey, the enemy camp is here. We're going to march around that once per day for 7 days with the ram's horns playing, whatever instruments that are equivalent. And then on the 7th day, we'll do that 7 times in the wall, scream and shout, and then we'll win. Would you have some concerns with that battle plan?
Yep.
Maybe.
But if it's the Lord himself telling you that, you're like, okay, less concerns now. It's weird, but I'm willing to do weird if I know it's the Lord. And we need to be in the same boat, that ultimately this is God speaking. God provides a battle plan, and it's unusual. But the way that God is going to deliver Jericho is probably far easier than what Joshua had in mind, which was maybe traditional siege warfare and wait them and starve them out for a couple of years. God wants to speed things up, make things far easier for the Israelites. And they had very few losses as a result, I would imagine. I don't know, it doesn't record the losses there, but I imagine it's probably less than 10 when the city ultimately falls, which is incredible. And so God is having them do this in an unusual way, but it's also going to put fear in their enemies as well. And so God's giving them these strange instructions, just as a reminder, like just as he taught through the manna, that God is ultimately the one that provides. He's providing a plan of battle. He's providing the city. It says that he has given them the city into their hands. And that even if it's strange and unusual, like the manna coming, and then on the seventh day not collecting it, they just got to trust God and listen to him. And this was a generation that was trained in faithfulness for 40 years. Unlike their forefathers, Joshua listened and obeyed. The Israelites listened and obeyed. And maybe on the sixth and seventh day, they were starting to think, I wonder what's going to happen. They understood that they go straight up in, but trying to visualize it and looking at those walls every single day, they did not lose fear. They had faith, and we need to do the same. That sometimes God does not appear, he can, but I don't think for any of us in person. But when God gives us, when there's a huge obstacle before us, we might start to devise up, I can do this, I can try this, I have this option as well. And sometimes God says, you know what? You're going to do it a different way. You're going to do it my way. And it sounds strange. It sounds alien. We might think, these other people might make fun of me. Some people might think I've gone crazy. Make sure it's God. But if it's him, trust him, because he is a God that provides and delivers. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for your protection, your provision, that you illustrated and you taught the Israelites, many of those from when they were just very, very young until adulthood, Lord, that they knew that you were a God that provided. Lord, all of us have lived long enough to know ultimately that you provide, that you rescue, that you deliver. And Lord, help us be sharing those things with younger generations. Help us be sharing those things in encouragement with our friends and family. And help us remember those things too when we get to our own walls of Jericho, Lord, when there's an insurmountable, extremely difficult obstacle before us, when there's a challenge that we just can't handle. Many of them we can't on our own, that we don't have to, that you're with us. Lord, when you give us instructions that are different than the way that the world thinks and works, help us make sure that it's you. But when we're sure, help us follow you without question. And I just pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Roy.